close your eyes now, and let us journey together back through the mists of time to an age before memory, before history, before even the world as we know it came to be. In the beginning, there was nothing but chaos. Not chaos as we understand it today, not disorder or confusion, but rather a vast, yawning void, an emptiness so complete that it defied comprehension. The ancient Greeks, gazing up at the star-scattered heavens from their rocky shores and mountain peaks, imagined this primordial nothingness as a great chasm, dark and formless, where neither light nor shadow had meaning. Some scholars believe that chaos was not merely empty space, but perhaps a kind of primordial soup, a swirling mist of potential from which all things would eventually emerge. And emerge they did. From this infinite darkness, the first beings stirred into existence, though how or why remains one of those eternal mysteries that even the wisest storytellers could never quite explain. First came Gaia, the earth herself. Picture her, if you will, not as a globe spinning through space as we know it today, but as a living presence, a mother of unimaginable power and patience. She was solid ground beneath uncertain feet, fertile soil that would one day nurture countless generations, mountains that scraped the belly of the sky. Gaia emerged from chaos complete and whole, bringing with her the very concept of substance, of something rather than nothing. Alongside her, or perhaps shortly after, the old stories vary, as old stories often do, came Tartarus, the deep abyss that would serve as both prison and punishment in the ages to come. If Gaia was the foundation, Tartarus was the basement, the dungeon, the darkness beneath even darkness. And then there was Eros, though not the cherubic archer we might imagine from later tales. This primordial Eros was desire itself, the force that draws things together, the irresistible urge to create and procreate that would drive so much of what was to follow. Without Eros, the universe might have remained static, each primordial being isolated in their own domain. But with desire came connection, and with connection came complications. Let us pause here for a moment and imagine these first beings. They were not gods as we typically envision them, not beings with human forms and human passions, at least not yet. They were concepts given consciousness, forces of nature with will and intent. Gaia, feeling the stirring of Eros within her vast form, brought forth from herself, parthenogenetically, as the scholars would say, her son and eventual consort, Uranus, the sky. Uranus stretched himself across his mother bride, covering her completely, and where they touched, at the horizon where earth meets sky, their union was eternal. The ancient Greeks, standing on hillsides at dusk, could see this divine embrace painted in purple and gold where the sun set. Together, Gaia and Uranus began to populate the cosmos with their children. First came the 12 Titans, 6 sons and 6 daughters, beings of immense power who would shape the world in ways both beautiful and terrible. Oceanus was among them, the great river that encircled the earth, and with him Tethys, his sister wife, who would bear 3,000 river gods, and 3,000 ocean nymphs. There was Hyperion, the watcher from above, and Theia, the divine light. Coeus represented intelligence, the questioning mind, while Phoebe embodied prophetic wisdom, the bright intellect that could pierce the veil of time. Crius, Mnemosyne, Themis, and Iapetus each had their domains and destinies, but perhaps most significant were the youngest of these 12, Cronus, crafty and ambitious, and Rhea, who would one day be called the Mother of Gods. Yet the Titans were not Gaia and Uranus's only offspring. In their fertile union, they also produced the 3 Cyclopes, not the crude, sheep-herding giant that Odysseus would one day encounter, but master craftsmen with single eyes that blazed like forges. Brontes was thunder, Steropes was lightning, and Argus was brightness itself. These 3 would one day forge the weapons that would reshape the cosmos. And then there were the Hecatonchires, the 100-handed ones. Try to picture them, if your mind can grasp such a thing. Cottus, Briareus, and Gyges, each with 50 heads and 100 arms, beings of such terrifying aspect and overwhelming strength that even their own father could not bear to look upon them. Here, we must speak of the first great dysfunction in the cosmic family, for Uranus, Skyfather though he was, proved to be a terrible parent. Perhaps it was fear that moved him, or perhaps disgust, or perhaps the simple tyrannical impulse to suppress any potential threat to his power. Whatever his motivation, Uranus looked upon his youngest children, the Cyclopes and the 100-handed ones, and found them monstrous. Rather than allow them to walk free upon their mother's surface, he thrust them back into Gaia's womb, or according to some tellings, imprisoned them in the depths of Tartarus. Imagine Gaia's pain, not just physical but emotional, as her children were denied the light, denied their birthright, denied even the chance to exist properly. The Earth Mother groaned under this burden, and her groans became earthquakes, her tears became springs and rivers, and her rage, her rage became something else entirely. She went to her Titan children, those who still walked free, and she spoke to them of vengeance. From her own body, from the adamantine bones of the earth itself, she drew forth a great sickle, its blade gleaming with purpose and possibility. "Who among you?" she asked, and we can imagine her voice like distant thunder, like the grinding of continental plates. "Who among you will take this weapon and free your siblings? Who will stand against the tyrant sky?" The Titans, for all their power, trembled at the thought. To raise a hand against Uranus was to challenge the very order of existence, to declare war on the heavens themselves. 11 of them stepped back, unwilling or unable to conceive of such an act. But Cronus, the youngest and most cunning, stepped forward. 11 of them stepped back, unwilling or unable to conceive of such an act. But Cronus, the youngest and most cunning, stepped forward. "I will do this deed, Mother," he said, and perhaps there was already ambition gleaming in his eyes. Or perhaps there was simply the rage of a son who had watched his siblings suffer. Gaia pressed the adamantine sickle into his hands, and together they devised a plan of such intimate violence that it would echo through all the ages of myth that followed. When evening came, as it always did, Uranus descended to cover Gaia in his embraces. The sky lay upon the earth in that primordial union, lost in passion, vulnerable in a way that he would never be again. And there, hidden in the shadows of his mother's body, Cronus waited with the sickle raised. What happened next was both birth and mutilation, creation and destruction intertwined in a single violent moment. Cronus swung the sickle in a great arc, castrating his father, severing Uranus from his generative power. The blood that fell upon the earth was not ordinary blood. How could it be from such a being? And where it touched Gaia's surface, new life sprang forth. From these crimson drops arose the Erinyes, the Furies, those dreadful sisters who would pursue kinslayers and oath-breakers to the ends of the earth. Alecto, Megaera, and Tisiphone, with serpents for hair and eyes that wept blood, they emerged fully formed and terrible, justice given its most frightening face. The giants too rose from this divine blood, massive beings who would one day wage war against the very heavens. And the Meliae, the ash tree nymphs, graceful and strong, from whose wood the first spears would be carved. But the severed parts of Uranus himself, these Cronus hurled into the wine-dark sea, and where they fell, the waters foamed and churned. From this foam, from this mixture of sea and sky and generative power, arose a figure of such beauty that even the waves themselves seemed to pause in wonder. Aphrodite, she would be called, though some say she was older than the Titans themselves, born from this primal act of violence, and yet embodying love and desire. She rode to shore on a shell, they say, or perhaps it was simply the caress of the waves that carried her, and wherever her feet touched, flowers bloomed. Uranus, maimed and raging, withdrew to the farthest reaches of the sky, cursing his son with a prophecy that would haunt Cronus for all his days. As you have overthrown me, so shall your own child overthrow you. And perhaps it was in that moment that the great wheel of fate began its inexorable turning. Now Cronus ruled, and the period that followed is sometimes called the Golden Age, though golden for whom, one might ask. The Titans parceled out the cosmos among themselves. Oceanus took the great world-encircling river, Hyperion claimed the movements of the sun, Theia the gleaming of precious metals and gems. Coos settled in the north, the axis around which the heavens turned, while Phoebe took the oracle that would one day be called Delphi. Mnemosyne became memory itself, the repository of all that was and had been. Themis established divine law, the proper ordering of things both natural and supernatural. It was, in its way, a time of establishment, of setting boundaries and domains that would persist through all the turbulent ages to come. Cronus himself took his sister Rhea as his queen, and together they ruled from Mount Othrys, which some say stood where Mount Olympus now rises, though others claim it was a different peak entirely, now worn down by the weight of ages. But the curse of Uranus worked like poison in Cronus's mind. The prophecy, that grating, gnawing prophecy, whispered to him in quiet moments. When Rhea first came to him, glowing with the news that she carried their first child, what should have been joy turned to cold dread in his chest. We must understand that gods do not think as mortals do. Time moves differently for them, and what seems like madness to us might seem like prudence to a being who measures existence in eons. When Rhea gave birth to their first child, Hestia, goddess of the hearth, Cronus looked upon his daughter and saw not a baby, but a threat. And so he did something that even now, after all the strange and terrible things we have already recounted, seems almost incomprehensible. He swallowed her whole. Rhea, we can imagine, must have stood frozen in shock and horror as her husband consumed their child. But Hestia did not die. How could a god truly die? She simply continued to exist within her father's belly, trapped in that divine prison. When Demeter was born, goddess of the harvest, Cronus swallowed her too. Then came Hera, regal even as an infant, and she followed her sisters down their father's throat. Hades emerged next, dark and solemn, and met the same fate. Then Poseidon, already roaring like the sea, was gulped down before he could even cry properly. 5 children, 5 divine beings with all the potential of their cosmic heritage, all trapped within their father's body. Rhea's grief transformed into something harder, sharper. She had watched her husband become the very monster he had once fought against. Perhaps worse, for at least Uranus had only imprisoned his children, not devoured them. When she felt the 6th child quickening within her, she knew she could not, would not, let this one meet the same fate. She went to her mother, Gaia, who had already seen one tyrant fall and was quite prepared to see another follow suit. Together, grandmother and mother devised a deception. When the time came for the 6th child to be born, Rhea traveled in secret to the island of Crete. Some say she gave birth in a cave on Mount Dicte. Others claim it was Mount Ida, but all agree that it was hidden, sacred, protected by ancient magic. There, in the darkness, lit only by the phosphorescent glow of cave formations that looked like stars embedded in stone, Zeus was born. The baby's first cry was so powerful that Gaia had to summon the Curetes, divine warriors, to dance and clash their spears against their shields, creating such a cacophony that Cronus, far away on his throne, would not hear his son's voice. Rhea wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes, perhaps whispering apologies to the cold granite as if it were truly her child, and presented it to Cronus. The Titan king, so consumed by his fear, so blinded by his determination to avoid his fate, didn't even look closely. He swallowed the stone just as he had swallowed his children, and it settled in his stomach with the weight of prophecy fulfilled, though he knew it not. Meanwhile, young Zeus was spirited away to be raised in secret. He swallowed the stone just as he had swallowed his children, and it settled in his stomach with the weight of prophecy fulfilled, though he knew it not. Meanwhile, young Zeus was spirited away to be raised in secret. The stories of Zeus's childhood on Crete are various and strange, as befits a god raised in hiding. Some say he was nursed by the goat Amalthea, whose horn would later become the cornucopia, the horn of plenty that could produce whatever its owner desired. Others tell of a divine bee named Melissa, who fed him honey, and perhaps this is why Zeus would later be associated with the golden sweetness that drips from combs. The nymphs of the mountain, the Meliae born from Uranus's blood, they too played their part, singing soft lullabies that sounded like wind through ash leaves. Picture, if you will, this divine child growing strong in the dappled sunlight of the Cretan caves, playing among stalactites that glittered like frozen starlight. The very island protected him. When he cried, the waves crashed louder against the shores. When he laughed, the birds sang to cover the sound. Even the trees bent their branches to hide him from any eyes that might peer down from Othrys. As Zeus grew, he came to understand his destiny, though who first told him the truth of his parentage remains unclear. Perhaps it was Gaia herself, appearing to him in dreams as the cave walls seemed to breathe and speak. Or maybe it was Metis, the Oceanid whose name meant wisdom, who would later become his first wife. She was cunning beyond measure, and it was she who devised the plan to free Zeus's siblings. The young god could not simply challenge his father, not yet. He needed his brothers and sisters, those divine beings trapped within Cronus's belly. So Metis prepared a special potion. Some say it was a mixture of mustard and wine. Others claim it was something far more exotic, distilled from flowers that grew only where ichor had been spilled. Zeus disguised himself as a cupbearer. Imagine the king of gods to be, serving wine like a common servant, keeping his power carefully veiled. He approached his father's court on Mount Othrys, where the Titans feasted and reveled, secure in their power. The great hall must have been magnificent beyond mortal comprehension, with pillars of cloud and floors of polished skystone, where music played that could drive mortals mad with its beauty. Cronus, grown complacent in his long rule, accepted the drink without suspicion. The moment the potion touched his lips, his stomach began to churn and rebel. First came the stone, expelled with such force that it flew across the hall and embedded itself in the earth at a place that would later be called Delphi, where it would be venerated for generations uncounted. Then, in reverse order of their swallowing, came his children. Poseidon emerged, gasping and roaring like a tsunami suddenly given form. Hades followed, dark and grim, his eyes already holding the shadows of the underworld he would one day rule. Hera came forth, her dignity somehow intact despite the indignity of her imprisonment. Then Demeter, already murmuring of seeds and harvests, of the cycles of growth and decay. And finally, Hestia, the firstborn and last freed, who would forever after prefer the quiet center of things to the chaos of conflict. The 6 siblings stood together for the first time, and in that moment, the balance of power in the cosmos fundamentally shifted. But we must not imagine that Cronus simply accepted this reversal. The Titan King roared with rage that shook the foundations of the world. and his cry brought his fellow Titans rushing to his aid. Thus began the Titanomachy, the War of the Titans, a conflict that would rage for 10 long years, though what is a decade to beings who measure time in the wearing away of mountains? The sides were drawn. On one side, Cronus and most of his Titan siblings, Coeus, Creus, Hyperion, and Iapetus, stood with him, their power vast and terrible. On the other, Zeus and his freed siblings, young but burning with the fury of the wronged. Interestingly, not all the Titans chose to fight against the Olympians. Oceanus, perhaps seeing the tide of change, remained neutral, continuing his eternal flow around the world's edges. Themis and Mnemosyne would eventually side with Zeus, drawn perhaps by some glimpse of future justice. And Prometheus, son of Iapetus, that forward-thinking Titan whose name meant forethought, he too saw which way the winds of fate were blowing. The war itself defies mortal description. Mountains were thrown like spears, seas boiled, the very fabric of reality stretched and tore. The Titans, established in their power, controlled the heights of Othrys. The younger gods made their base on Mount Olympus, a peak that scraped the belly of the heavens. For 9 years, neither side could gain a decisive advantage. Zeus hurled his lightning, for he had claimed his father's power over the sky. But the Titans were too strong, too established in their might. It seemed the conflict might rage forever, locked in a cosmic stalemate that would leave the world forever scarred. But then Gaia, the Earth Mother who had seen enough of her children's blood spilled, offered Zeus counsel. "In Tartarus," she whispered, her voice like the grinding of tectonic plates, "in the deepest places where your father cast them, your uncles wait." She spoke of the Cyclopes and the 100-handed ones, those first prisoners of Uranus, then of Cronus. "Free them," she advised, "and you will have allies whose power has been fermenting in darkness and rage for eons uncounted." So Zeus and his brothers descended to Tartarus, that realm so deep that an anvil dropped from earth would fall for 9 days before reaching its gates. The darkness there was not merely the absence of light, but a living thing that pressed against them, trying to seep into their divine essence. They found the prison of the Cyclopes first, bonds forged from the very concept of imprisonment itself. Zeus shattered these chains with his newfound might, and the 3 one-eyed giants stood free for the first time since their birth. In gratitude, and perhaps recognizing the hand of fate at work, the Cyclopes gave the 3 brothers gifts that would define their reigns forever. To Zeus, they gave the thunderbolt, forged from the primal storm that had existed before the sky itself. Feel the weight of it in his hand, crackling with potential, able to split mountains or pierce the hearts of titans. To Poseidon, they presented the trident, 3-pronged and perfect, which could shake the earth, summon tsunamis, or call forth springs from barren rock. To Hades, they gifted the helm of invisibility, crafted from the shadows that pooled at the bottom of existence, allowing its wearer to move unseen even by divine eyes. Deeper still the brothers ventured, until they found the 100-handed ones. These beings, so terrible that 2 generations of sky fathers had imprisoned them rather than look upon them, stood in chains so massive that each link was the size of a mountain. When Zeus freed them, their gratitude was a terrible thing to behold. Each of their 300 hands seized a boulder, and they followed the Olympians back to the surface, ready to rain destruction upon their former captors. The tide of war turned in a single day. Each of their 300 hands seized a boulder, and they followed the Olympians back to the surface, ready to rain destruction upon their former captors. The tide of war turned in a single day. Picture, if your mind can grasp it, 300 massive hands all hurling boulders simultaneously, a rain of stone so thick it blotted out the sun. The Titans, for all their ancient might, had never faced such an assault. While they struggled to defend against this overwhelming barrage, Zeus struck with his thunderbolts, each one finding its mark with divine precision. The very air split with the sound of his attacks, a cracking that echoed in the marrow of mountains. Poseidon shook the earth itself, opening great chasms that swallowed Titan fortifications whole, while Hades moved unseen among the enemy, sowing confusion and fear. Yes, even Titans could know fear. The final battle was terrible beyond description. Hyperion, who had controlled the movements of the sun, found his light dimmed by the shadows of flying boulders. Coeus, despite all his intelligence, could not think fast enough to counter 300 hands working in perfect, furious unity. One by one, the Titans fell, and as they fell, Zeus bound them with chains forged from the very same adamantine that had once formed Cronus's sickle. How fitting, some might say, that the weapon of their rise became the substance of their binding. Cronus himself fought until the very end, wielding time itself as a weapon, trying to age his children to dust or reverse them to before their birth. But Zeus had grown beyond his father's power, and in their final confrontation, son overcame sire just as the prophecy had foretold. The defeated Titans were cast down into Tartarus, that prison realm where they would remain for eternity. Or at least, most of them would. Zeus, showing a mercy his father had never possessed, spared those who had not fought against him. Oceanus continued his eternal flow. Themis became a counselor to the new order. Mnemosyne would bear Zeus' daughters, who would become the Muses. Even some who had fought were eventually forgiven. Atlas, son of Iapetus, was given the special punishment of holding up the sky, preventing Uranus from ever again embracing Gaia in that primordial union. Stand with me for a moment at the dawn of the Olympian age, as Zeus and his siblings divided the cosmos among themselves. They cast lots, they say, though perhaps fate itself guided which brother would receive which domain. Zeus drew the sky and became king of gods and mortals, ruling from Olympus with his thunderbolt as scepter. Poseidon received the seas, all the waters of the world save the underworld rivers, and he descended to his palace beneath the waves, where no sunlight reached, but where phosphorescent creatures provided their own ethereal glow. Hades drew what some might call the shortest lot, the underworld, the realm of the dead, though in truth, his kingdom would grow to be the most populous of all, for all mortals eventually become his subjects. The sisters, as was the custom even among gods, were not included in this lottery, but they claimed their own domains. Hestia, firstborn and last freed, chose the hearth, that sacred center of every home where families gathered and stories were told. She would remain a virgin goddess, devoted to tending the sacred flame that connected mortals to immortals. Demeter took dominion over the harvest, the cycles of growth and death that would sustain all mortal life. Hera, proud and regal, became Zeus's wife and queen of the gods, though their marriage would be complicated, to speak gently of it. Now let us speak of this new order, this Olympian age that replaced the time of the Titans. Zeus established his court on Mount Olympus, that peak which touches the heavens, where the air is so thin that mortals would perish, but where gods breathe easily the rarefied atmosphere of divinity. The palaces there were built by Hephaestus. But wait, we run ahead of ourselves, for Hephaestus was not yet born. Let us say instead that the Cyclopes, in gratitude for their freedom, built the first halls, structures of cloud marble and sky crystal that caught the light of dawn and held it through the day. Zeus took many wives, as was his nature, a nature that would cause no end of strife in the eons to come. His first wife was Metis, she who had helped him free his siblings. But when Gaia and Uranus prophesied that Metis would bear a daughter equal to Zeus in wisdom, and then a son who would surpass him in power, Zeus did something that proved the apple does not fall far from the tree. He swallowed Metis whole, just as his father had swallowed his siblings. Yet from this act came something unexpected. Zeus began to suffer terrible headaches, pain so intense that his roars of agony caused thunderstorms across the Mediterranean. Finally, he called for Hephaestus, or in some tellings, Prometheus, to split his skull with an axe. From the cleft in his head sprang Athena, fully grown and armored, shouting a war cry that echoed across all creation. She was wisdom and warfare combined, strategy and strength, her gray eyes holding the intelligence of her mother and the power of her father. The irony was not lost on anyone. Zeus had swallowed Metis to prevent the birth of a son who might overthrow him, and instead got a daughter who would become one of the most powerful and influential of all the Olympians. After Metis came Themis, the Titaness of divine law, and she bore Zeus the fates, Clotho who spun the thread of life, Lachesis who measured it, and Atropos who cut it. Even Zeus himself could not override their decisions, or perhaps he chose not to, understanding that even gods must bow to some higher order. Themis also bore the seasons, those gentle goddesses who marked the turning of the year and the proper time for all things. Then came Eurynome, an Oceanid of grace and beauty, who gave Zeus the three graces, Aglaia, Euphrosyne, and Thalia, who brought joy and beauty to both divine and mortal gatherings. Demeter, his own sister, bore him Persephone, though that is a tale of loss and return that we shall tell in its proper time. Mnemosyne, the Titaness of memory, lay with Zeus for 9 consecutive nights, and from this union came the 9 muses, each governing a different art. Calliope ruled epic poetry, Clio history, Euterpe lyric poetry, Thalia comedy, Melpomene tragedy, Terpsichore dance, Erato love poetry, Polyhymnia sacred hymns, and Urania astronomy. They made their home on Mount Helicon, where springs of inspiration bubbled up from the rocks. Leto, another Titaness, bore Zeus the twins Apollo and Artemis, though their birth was fraught with peril. Hera, already Zeus's wife by this time, flew into such a rage that she forbade any land from harboring the pregnant Leto. Leto, another Titaness, bore Zeus the twins Apollo and Artemis, though their birth was fraught with peril. Hera, already Zeus's wife by this time, flew into such a rage that she forbade any land from harboring the pregnant Leto. The poor Titaness wandered the earth, heavy with divine children, searching for any place that would allow her to give birth. Every shore turned her away, every island fled from her approach, for all feared the wrath of jealous Hera. Finally, Leto came to Delos, a floating island that was not technically land at all, but rather a piece of earth that drifted upon the waves, unanchored to the sea floor. Some say it was Asteria, Leto's own sister, who had transformed herself into this island to escape Zeus's advances. Here, perhaps out of sympathy, perhaps because as a floating island it was not bound by Hera's decree, Delos accepted Leto. For 9 days and 9 nights, Leto labored, for Hera had also detained Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth. The other goddesses, taking pity, finally bribed Eileithyia with a golden necklace longer than the tallest tree, and she slipped away from Hera to attend the birth. Artemis was born first, and immediately, though just minutes old, she helped deliver her twin brother Apollo. As Apollo emerged, the island of Delos was flooded with golden light, and 4 pillars rose from the seafloor to anchor it forever in place. Sacred swans circled the island 7 times, singing songs so beautiful that even the waves paused to listen. Apollo would become the god of music, prophecy, healing, and the sun itself, while Artemis chose the moon, the hunt, and eternal virginity. But let us return to Olympus, where Zeus's marriage to Hera was becoming the source of endless divine drama. Hera was not merely wife, but queen, and she possessed a dignity and power that demanded respect. Yet Zeus could not, or would not, remain faithful to her. His affairs with goddesses, nymphs, and mortal women were countless, and each one drove Hera to greater heights of creative vengeance. She could not directly harm Zeus, he was too powerful, but his lovers and their children, they were fair game for her wrath. Consider poor Io, a mortal priestess whom Zeus transformed into a white heifer to hide her from Hera's suspicion. But Hera was no fool. She requested the beautiful cow as a gift, and Zeus, trapped by his own deception, could not refuse. Hera set the 100-eyed giant Argus to guard Io, ensuring that some of his eyes were always open, always watching. Zeus sent Hermes to rescue Io, and the clever god lulled Argus to sleep with stories and songs, every single eye finally closing, before striking off the giant's head. Hera, in her grief and fury, took Argus's 100 eyes and placed them in the tail of her sacred bird, the peacock, where they remain to this day. But she wasn't finished with Io, sending a gadfly to torment the cow maiden, driving her in madness across the world until finally, in Egypt, Zeus was able to restore her human form. Then there was Semele, a mortal princess of Thebes who caught Zeus's eye. Hera, disguising herself as an old nurse, befriended the pregnant girl and planted seeds of doubt. "How do you know," the disguised goddess whispered, "that your lover is truly Zeus? Any man might claim to be the king of gods. Make him prove it. Ask him to appear before you in his true divine form as he appears to his wife Hera." Semele, young and insecure, was convinced. When Zeus next visited, she made him swear an unbreakable oath on the river Styx to grant her one request. The moment he swore, dread filled his heart, for he knew what she would ask, and indeed, she demanded to see him in his divine glory. Zeus begged her to reconsider, but the oath was sworn, and even gods cannot break such vows. He appeared in his smallest form possible, but even the least of his divine manifestations was thunder and lightning, holy fire that no mortal flesh could withstand. Semele was instantly incinerated, but Zeus managed to save the unborn child from her womb, sewing the baby into his own thigh to complete the gestation. Thus was Dionysus born, twice born they would call him, from mortal mother and divine father's thigh. He would become the god of wine, ecstasy, and divine madness, forever walking the line between mortal and immortal, sanity and insanity. Hermes, the messenger god, deserves his own moment in our tale. Born from Zeus's union with Maia, a daughter of Atlas, Hermes proved his divine nature from the moment of his birth. On his very first day of life, he slipped from his cradle and stole Apollo's sacred cattle, driving them backward to confuse their tracks and fashioning shoes from bark to disguise his own footprints. When Apollo discovered the theft and dragged the infant before Zeus for judgment, Hermes pulled out a new invention, the lyre, crafted from a tortoise shell and cowgut, and played music so sweet that Apollo forgot his anger. They traded, the lyre for the cattle, and Apollo gained dominion over music, while Hermes became the god of thieves, travelers, and all who live by their wits. Zeus was so amused by his infant son's audacity that he made Hermes his personal messenger, giving him winged sandals to speed his travels and a caduceus, a staff entwined with serpents, as a symbol of his authority. Ares, the god of war, was one of the few legitimate children of Zeus and Hera, yet neither parent seemed particularly fond of him. Where Athena represented strategic warfare, Ares embodied the brutal, bloodthirsty aspect of combat. He delighted in the clash of bronze, the screams of the dying, the chaos of the battlefield. Even the other gods found him distasteful, this divine brute who seemed to lack any redeeming qualities save his impressive physique. Perhaps that's what attracted Aphrodite to him, though she was married to Hephaestus at the time. Ah, Aphrodite. We mentioned her birth from the sea foam. But her integration into the Olympian order was not without its complications. She was beauty incarnate, desire given form, and every god wanted her as wife. To prevent war among the Olympians, Zeus gave her to Hephaestus, the smith god. Now, Hephaestus himself had an unusual origin. Some say Hera bore him alone in retaliation for Zeus birthing Athena from his head, though others claim Zeus was his father. Either way, the baby was born lame, and Hera, in her shame and disgust, hurled him from Olympus. He fell for a full day, they say, before crashing into the sea, where the sea nymphs Thetis and Eurynome raised him in an underwater grotto. There he learned his craft, creating jewelry so beautiful that Hera herself coveted it, not knowing its source. When he sent her a golden throne as a gift, she sat upon it eagerly, only to find herself trapped by invisible chains. No god could free her, and Hephaestus refused to return to Olympus to release her, until finally Dionysus got him drunk and persuaded him to relent. Thus the lame smith god returned to his birthplace, and Zeus, impressed by his skill and cunning, gave him Aphrodite as wife. But Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty, felt no love for her forge-scarred husband, no matter how skilled his hands. She found her passion instead in the arms of Ares, and their affair was the worst-kept secret on Olympus. Hephaestus, however, was patient and clever. He forged a net of such fine golden wire that it was invisible to the eye yet stronger than any chains. One night, when Aphrodite and Ares lay together in the marriage bed, Hephaestus sprung his trap. The net fell upon the lovers, binding them together in their intimate embrace, and Hephaestus called all the gods to witness his wife's shame. The goddesses, more discreet, stayed away, but the male gods came and laughed. Poseidon eventually convinced Hephaestus to release them, promising that Ares would pay proper compensation, though the war god fled to Thrace without paying a single coin. From the union of Aphrodite and Ares came several children, Phobos and Deimos, Fear and Terror, who would accompany their father to battle, and Harmonia, whose name meant harmony, the peaceful reconciliation of love and strife. But let us step back from these divine soap operas and consider the relationship between the Olympians and the mortals who had begun to populate the earth. For Zeus, having established his rule over gods, turned his attention to creating and managing humanity. The first humans, some say, were fashioned during the golden age of Cronus, living without toil or sorrow, dying peacefully as if falling asleep. When they passed, they became benevolent spirits, guardians who watched over their descendants. But these first humans left no children, or perhaps they simply faded as the age of Titans faded, and new races had to be created. The silver race came next, inferior to the golden but still blessed, with long life, yet they were foolish and violent, refusing to honor the gods, and Zeus destroyed them, though they too became spirits, lesser than the golden race but still honored. The bronze race followed, fashioned from ash trees, strong and terrible, devoted to warfare. They destroyed themselves in their endless conflicts, descending to Hades without glory or remembrance. Then came the age of heroes, those demigods and champions whose stories we shall soon explore. And finally, the Iron Race, our own age, as the Greeks understood it, where good and evil were mixed, where toil and suffering were constant companions, but where glory could still be won by the brave and cunning. But the creation of humanity itself, in one of the most famous tales, was attributed to Prometheus, that far-seeing Titan who had sided with Zeus during the Titanomachy. His name meant forethought, and he was paired with his brother Epimetheus, afterthought, who acted first and considered consequences later. Prometheus shaped humans from clay, mixing earth and water, breathing divine essence into mortal form. Some say Athena breathed the soul into these clay figures, while Prometheus provided the form. He fashioned them to stand upright like the gods themselves, not bent toward the earth like other animals. But these early humans were weak and helpless, with no fur against the cold, no claws for hunting, no venom for defense. They shivered in the darkness, eating raw food, dying from exposure and predation. Prometheus looked upon his creation with the fondness of a father, and his heart ached for their suffering. He went to Zeus and asked permission to give humanity fire, that divine element that belonged to the gods alone. Zeus refused. Fire was too powerful, too dangerous, too much like the divine for mere mortals to possess. But Prometheus, driven by compassion, or perhaps by pride in his creation, defied the king of gods. He crept into Olympus itself, or perhaps to the forge of Hephaestus, or maybe to the chariot of the sun, and there he stole a spark of holy fire. He concealed it in a hollow fennel stalk, the dry pith burning slowly, and brought it down to humanity. With fire came warmth and light. With fire came the ability to cook food, making it more nourishing and easier to digest. With fire came the power to forge metals, to create tools and weapons. With fire came civilization itself. Humanity flourished under this stolen gift, building their first cities, developing their first arts. But Zeus, watching from Olympus, saw the smoke rising from 1,000 mortal hearths and knew immediately what had happened. His rage was volcanic, thunderous, absolute. Prometheus had not merely disobeyed him, but had stolen from the gods, had empowered mortals beyond their station, had upset the careful balance between divine and mortal realms. The punishment had to be severe, eternal, a warning to any who might consider defying the king of gods. Zeus ordered Prometheus chained to a mountain peak in the Caucasus, bound with unbreakable adamantine chains. There, every day, an eagle, some say it was the sacred eagle of Zeus himself, would come to feast on Prometheus's liver. Being immortal, Prometheus could not die from this torment. Each night, his liver would regenerate, growing back completely by dawn. And each day, the eagle would return to tear it out again, fresh agony in an eternal cycle. Imagine Prometheus there, spread-eagled on the cold stone, the wind howling around him, watching the sun trace its path across the sky, as he waited for the eagle's shadow. The pain was excruciating, yes, but perhaps worse was the knowledge. Prometheus, whose name meant forethought, who could see future possibilities, knew that this punishment would last for thousands of years. He knew, too, a secret about Zeus. He had learned of a prophecy that one of Zeus's sons would eventually overthrow him, just as Zeus had overthrown Cronus. The Olympians came to him, demanding to know which son, which mother, how it could be prevented. But Prometheus, even in his agony, kept the secret locked behind his teeth. It was perhaps his only leverage, the one thing that might eventually buy his freedom. And indeed, many ages later, Heracles would free him as one of his labors, shooting down the eagle with his arrows, though the exact circumstances vary in the telling. But we are getting ahead of ourselves again. Let us return to Zeus's vengeance, for the king of gods was not content to punish only Prometheus. But we are getting ahead of ourselves again. Let us return to Zeus's vengeance, for the king of gods was not content to punish only Prometheus. Humanity had benefited from the theft of fire, and in Zeus's eyes, they too deserved punishment. So the king of gods devised a plan of such subtle cruelty that it would affect every generation of humanity that would ever live. He called upon Hephaestus to create something that had never existed before. "Fashion me a woman," Zeus commanded, for until this point humanity had been only male, reproducing through some means the myths do not quite specify. Hephaestus went to his forge, and from clay and divine essence he shaped a form of such surpassing beauty that even the smith god stepped back in wonder at his own creation. Each of the Olympians contributed something to this first woman. Aphrodite gave her grace and desire, the ability to ignite longing in the hearts of men. Athena taught her weaving and handicrafts, dressing her in silver robes that caught the light like moonbeams. Hermes gave her a cunning mind, and also, this is important, the capacity for lies and flattery. The Graces adorned her with jewelry, the seasons crowned her with spring flowers, and when she was complete, she was named Pandora, which means all gifted, for all the gods had given her something. She was beautiful beyond mortal comprehension, her eyes deep as wells, her voice like honey and wine. But she was also the first trap, a punishment wrapped in allurement. Zeus gave her one more gift, a large jar, sometimes mistranslated as a box in later retellings. "Never open this," he instructed her, knowing full well what such a prohibition would do to a curious mind equipped by Hermes with cunning. Then he sent her to Epimetheus, Prometheus's brother, who despite his brother's warnings never to accept gifts from Zeus, took one look at Pandora and fell instantly in love. Epimetheus married her, and for a time they were happy. But the jar sat in their home, sealed and mysterious, calling to Pandora. Every day she would pass it, and every day the urge to peek inside grew stronger. What harm could come from just a quick look? She must have thought. Surely Zeus would not give me something dangerous. Finally, Unable to resist any longer, Pandora lifted the lid. Immediately, from the jar's mouth erupted every evil and misfortune that would plague humanity forever after. Disease came first, swarming like insects, settling into human bodies to cause fever, plague, corruption. Pain followed, both physical and emotional, the capacity to suffer that had been unknown to earlier races. Toil and hardship flew out, ensuring that humans would have to struggle for their survival. Envy, hatred, spite, greed, violence, all the dark impulses of the human heart emerged in a choking cloud. Death itself, previously gentle as sleep, became terrible and fearful. Old age came with its indignities, making beauty fade and strength fail. Pandora, horrified at what she had unleashed, slammed the lid back down. But it was too late. All the evils had escaped, spreading across the world like smoke that could never be recaptured. Only one thing remained in the jar, trapped when Pandora closed the lid: hope. Scholars and philosophers have debated for millennia what this means. Is hope kept safe for humanity, something we can always access even when evils surround us? Or is hope trapped away from us, the one comfort we cannot reach? Or perhaps, and this is a darker reading, hope is itself a curse, the thing that keeps us striving despite knowing that death awaits us all. The Greeks had no single answer, for their myths were not simple moral tales, but complex reflections on the nature of existence. Regardless, from that moment forward, humanity knew suffering, and Zeus's revenge on Prometheus was complete. Yet despite these punishments, despite the clear danger of angering the gods, mortals continued to push boundaries, to seek more than their station allowed. The gods, watching from Olympus, saw humanity spread across the earth, building cities, waging wars, creating art and civilization. Sometimes the gods intervened in mortal affairs, favoring some, destroying others, taking mortal lovers, and producing half-divine children. These demigods, neither fully mortal nor fully divine, became the heroes of the age. Perseus was among the first of these great heroes. His mother was Danae, a princess of Argos, locked in a bronze tower by her father Acrisius after a prophecy declared that his grandson would kill him. But Zeus, ever resourceful in pursuing mortal women, transformed himself into a shower of golden light and visited Danae in her prison. From this union, Perseus was born. When Acrisius discovered the baby, he could not bring himself to kill his own daughter and grandson directly. Such a murder would bring divine punishment. Instead, he sealed them both in a wooden chest and cast them into the sea, leaving their fate to the gods. Poseidon guided the chest to the island of Seriphos, where a kind fisherman named Dictys found them and raised Perseus as his own. Years passed, and Perseus grew strong and brave, but eventually came to the attention of Polydectes, the king of Seriphos, who desired Danae. Polydectes saw Perseus as an obstacle and schemed to be rid of him. he announced that he would marry another woman and demanded gifts from all his subjects. When Perseus, poor as he was, claimed he would bring any gift the king desired, even the head of Medusa herself, Polydectes immediately accepted. Now, Medusa was one of the three Gorgons, sisters who lived at the edge of the world. Once she had been beautiful, a priestess of Athena, but Poseidon had violated her in Athena's temple. Athena, unable or unwilling to punish her uncle Poseidon, had instead transformed Medusa into a monster. Her hair became living serpents. Her gaze turned anyone who looked upon her to stone. Her sisters, Stheno and Euryale, had also been transformed, and the three lived in isolation, surrounded by the stone statues of those who had attempted to slay them. Perseus's boast seemed to doom him, but the gods, for their own reasons, decided to help. Athena appeared to him, still carrying her grudge against Medusa, and lent him her polished shield. Never look directly at her, the goddess warned. Use the shield as a mirror. Hermes gave him a sword sharp enough to cut through the Gorgon's scales and an adamantine sickle, perhaps the very one that Cronus had used against Uranus, though the stories are unclear. The hero received winged sandals to carry him across the sky, a cap of invisibility from Hades, and a magical bag that would hold Medusa's head without turning the carrier to stone. Thus equipped, Perseus sought the Grey, three ancient sisters who shared a single eye and tooth between them. They alone knew the location of the Gorgon's lair. Perseus stole their eye as they passed it between them, refusing to return it until they revealed what he needed to know. Reluctantly, they told him of the island at the edge of night where the Gorgons dwelt. Perseus stole their eye as they passed it between them, refusing to return it until they revealed what he needed to know. Reluctantly, they told him of the island at the edge of night where the Gorgons dwelt. Perseus flew on his winged sandals across the wine-dark sea, over waters where no ships sailed, to shores where the sun barely reached. He found the Gorgons sleeping, surrounded by a garden of stone, men, women, even animals, all frozen in their final moments of terror. Using Athena's shield as a mirror, Perseus approached without looking directly at the sisters. In the polished bronze, he could see Medusa's reflection, her serpent hair writhing even in sleep, her face that had once been beautiful, now twisted by divine curse. Some say he felt pity for her in that moment, understanding that she too was a victim of the gods' cruelty. But he had made his boast, and heroes must fulfill their oaths. With one swift stroke of his sword, guided by the reflection in his shield, Perseus severed Medusa's head from her neck. The sound awakened her immortal sisters, Stheno and Euryale, who shrieked with rage that could curdle blood. But Perseus was already wearing the cap of invisibility, and though they searched frantically, blindly reaching for him, he eluded their grasp and escaped into the sky. From Medusa's severed neck sprang two final surprises: Pegasus, the winged horse born of her union with Poseidon, and Chrysaor, a giant wielding a golden sword. Perseus placed Medusa's head in his magical bag and began his journey home. On his way, flying over the coast of Ethiopia, he saw a woman chained to a rock by the sea, waves crashing around her, her face lifted in either prayer or resignation. This was Andromeda, daughter of King Cepheus and Queen Cassiopeia. Her mother had made the fatal error of boasting that her daughter was more beautiful than the Nereids, the sea nymphs. Poseidon, angered by this slight against his subjects, had sent a sea monster to ravage the coast. The oracle declared that only by sacrificing Andromeda to the beast could the kingdom be saved. So there she stood, chained to the rocks, waiting for death to rise from the depths. Perseus, seeing her beauty and her courage, fell instantly in love, as heroes in myths tend to do. He descended and made a bargain with her parents. He would slay the monster if they would give him Andromeda's hand in marriage. Desperate, they agreed. When the sea monster emerged, all tentacles and teeth and ancient rage, Perseus drew forth Medusa's head. Even dead, the Gorgon's gaze retained its power. The monster looked upon that terrible face and instantly turned to stone, sinking beneath the waves as a new reef. Perseus freed Andromeda, and they were wed, though not without complications. She had been promised to another, her uncle Phineus, who arrived at the wedding with an armed band. Once again, Medusa's head proved useful, and Phineus and his men became permanent statuary at the feast. Eventually, Perseus returned to Seriphos with his bride, only to find that King Polydectes had been forcing himself upon Danae in her son's absence. Perseus arrived at the palace where Polydectes was feasting with his followers, all of whom had scorned Perseus and doubted his quest. "I have brought the gift I promised," Perseus announced. The king and his court laughed, disbelieving, mocking. "Then show us," Polydectes sneered. "Close your eyes, mother," Perseus called to Danae. Then he drew forth the head of Medusa. The laughter died on their lips, literally, as every man in that hall turned to stone. Perseus gave the head to Athena, who placed it on her aegis, her shield, where it would remain forever as a warning to her enemies. The prophecy about Acrisius came true as well, though Perseus tried to avoid it. Years later, competing in athletic games, Perseus threw a discus that went astray, perhaps blown by the wind, perhaps guided by fate, and struck his grandfather in the crowd, killing him instantly. Even heroes cannot escape their destiny. Theseus was another great hero, son of Aegeus, king of Athens, or perhaps son of Poseidon, for his mother Aethra had lain with both god and king on the same night. He grew up in his mother's homeland, and when he came of age, she led him to a great boulder. "Your father," she said, "left his sword and sandals beneath this stone. If you can lift it, you are ready to claim your inheritance in Athens." Theseus, strong beyond his years, rolled the boulder aside as if it were a pebble and claimed the tokens of his heritage. Against his mother's wishes, he chose to travel to Athens by the dangerous land route rather than the safer sea voyage, seeking to prove himself through trials. And trials he found. Along the road, he encountered a series of bandits and monsters who had been terrorizing travelers for years. Periphetes, who wielded a bronze club and used it to murder passers-by, was the first to fall. Theseus took his club and carried it thereafter as his own weapon. Sinis, called the pine bender, would tie victims between two bent pine trees and tear them apart when the trees sprang back. Theseus gave him the same treatment. The Crommyonian sow, a monstrous wild pig, terrorized the countryside until Theseus hunted it down. Siren forced travelers to wash his feet at the edge of a cliff, then kicked them into the sea where a giant turtle devoured them. Theseus kicked Siren into the sea instead. Cercyon challenged all comers to wrestling matches to the death. Theseus accepted and broke the bandits' back. Finally, Procrustes, whose name means the stretcher, offered hospitality to travelers, then forced them to lie on his iron bed. If they were too short, he stretched them on a rack until they fit. If too tall, he cut off their legs. Theseus fit him to his own bed permanently. By the time he arrived in Athens, Theseus had already earned a reputation as a hero and monster slayer. But Athens itself held greater challenges. His father, King Aegeus, had married the sorceress Medea after she fled from Jason. But that's another story we'll tell in its time. Medea, through her arts, knew immediately who Theseus was, and she feared he would supplant her own son as heir to Athens. She convinced Aegeus, who did not yet recognize his son, that this stranger was dangerous. At a feast of welcome, she offered Theseus a cup of poisoned wine. But just as Theseus raised the cup to his lips, he drew his sword to cut his meat. Aegeus recognized the blade immediately, his own sword, left beneath the stone so many years ago. He struck the cup from Theseus's hand, the wine spilling across the floor where it hissed and burned the stone. Medea fled Athens in her dragon-drawn chariot, and Aegeus embraced his son. But Theseus's greatest challenge was yet to come. Every 9 years, Athens was forced to send 7 young men and 7 young women as tribute to King Minos of Crete. This terrible price was payment for the death of Minos's son Androgeos, who had been murdered by jealous Athenians after winning all the prizes at their games. The 14 youths were sent into the labyrinth, an impossibly complex maze beneath Minos's palace, designed by the master craftsman Daedalus. At the heart of this maze lived the Minotaur, a creature with the body of a man and the head of a bull. The Minotaur was Minos's shame and secret, born from his wife, Pasiphae's unnatural union with a sacred bull, a punishment from Poseidon for Minos's greed. The creature devoured the Athenian youths, and none who entered the labyrinth ever returned. When the time came for the third tribute, Theseus volunteered to go as one of the 7 young men. Some say he was chosen by lot and accepted his fate heroically, others that he insisted on going despite his father's protests. Aegeus made his son promise that if he survived and defeated the Minotaur, He would change his ship's black sails to white on the return journey, so that Aegeus would know from afar that his son lived. The ship bearing its cargo of doomed youth arrived in Crete, where the tributes were paraded before King Minos and his court. There, Ariadne, daughter of Minos, saw Theseus and felt Eros's arrow pierce her heart. Love at first sight, the poets call it, though perhaps it was simply fate working through mortal emotions. Ariadne went to Daedalus, the architect of the labyrinth, and begged for his help. He gave her a ball of thread, explaining that Theseus should tie one end at the entrance and unwind it as he ventured deeper, thus marking his path back. The night before the tributes were to enter the maze, Ariadne came to Theseus in secret. "I will help you," she whispered, "but you must promise to take me with you when you escape, to make me your wife." Theseus swore on the river Styx, that most binding of oaths, and Ariadne gave him the thread and a sword. At dawn, the 14 Athenians were thrust into the labyrinth. Theseus told his companions to wait by the entrance while he ventured into the twisting passages alone, unwinding the thread as he went. The labyrinth was a nightmare of architecture, corridors that seemed to loop back on themselves, stairs that led nowhere, walls that shifted when you weren't looking directly at them. Daedalus had built it too well. It was said that even he could barely navigate it without getting lost. Deep in the maze, Theseus heard it before he saw it. The bellowing of the Minotaur, a sound that was neither fully human nor fully animal, but something horrifically in between. He found the creature in the central chamber, surrounded by the bones of previous victims. The Minotaur was massive, its bullhead grotesque on its muscular human body, its eyes holding a terrible intelligence. For this was no mere beast, but a thinking creature driven mad by isolation and fed on human flesh. They fought in that chamber of bones, hero and monster, while the thread lay forgotten on the floor. The Minotaur's strength was overwhelming, but Theseus had skill and desperation. Some say he used his sword, others that he strangled the beast with his bare hands, using the thread itself as a garrote. Still others claim he used the Minotaur's own horn, broken off in combat, to pierce its throat. However it happened, the Minotaur fell, its blood pooling black in the darkness. Theseus followed his thread back through the maze, gathering his fellow Athenians, and together they escaped to where Ariadne waited with a ship she had prepared. They fled Crete in the night, but here the story takes a darker turn. On the island of Naxos, where they stopped to rest, something happened that storytellers have never quite agreed upon. Some say Dionysus appeared to Theseus in a dream, claiming Ariadne for his own bride and threatening destruction if Theseus didn't abandon her. Others say Theseus simply grew tired of her, or feared bringing a foreign princess to Athens, or was commanded by Athena to leave her. The cruelest version says he simply forgot her, sailing away while she slept on the beach. Whatever the reason, Ariadne woke alone on Naxos, abandoned by the man she had betrayed her family for. Her cries of anguish reached Olympus itself, and Dionysus, god of wine and ecstasy, came to comfort her. He made her his wife and placed her wedding crown among the stars as the constellation Corona Borealis. Meanwhile, Theseus sailed on toward Athens, and in his excitement, or perhaps his guilt over Ariadne, he forgot to change the black sails to white. King Aegeus, watching from the cliffs of Cape Sunion, saw the black sails approaching and believed his son was dead. In his despair, he threw himself from the cliffs into the sea, which thereafter bore his name, the Aegean. Thus Theseus returned victorious but orphaned, a hero who had saved Athens but lost both his lover and his father. He became king and would have many more adventures, battles with Amazons, a journey to the underworld, political reforms that would shape Athens's future. But perhaps no hero's story is more complex, more filled with triumph and tragedy than that of Heracles. Heracles, or Hercules, as the Romans would call him, was the son of Zeus and Alcmene, a mortal woman descended from Perseus. Zeus, in one of his most elaborate deceptions, took the form of Alcmene's husband Amphitryon, while the real Amphitryon was away at war. He made the night last 3 times its normal length to extend his time with her. When the real Amphitryon returned the next day and lay with his wife, she conceived twins, Heracles, son of Zeus, and Iphicles, son of Amphitryon. Hera's jealousy toward this child exceeded even her usual vindictiveness. When Heracles was just 8 months old, she sent 2 enormous serpents into his nursery. Iphicles screamed in terror, but baby Heracles grabbed a snake in each chubby fist and strangled them, gurgling with delight as if they were toys. Amphitryon, finding his infant son playing with dead serpents, knew then that this was no ordinary child. He arranged for the finest teachers in all of Greece to train Heracles. Linus taught him music, though that ended badly when Heracles, frustrated by criticism, struck his teacher with a lyre and killed him instantly. Chiron, the wise centaur, taught him archery and medicine. Castor instructed him in swordsmanship, while Autolycus, grandfather of Odysseus, taught him wrestling. By the time he reached manhood, Heracles was the strongest mortal who had ever lived, standing head and shoulders above other men, his strength so great he had to learn to move carefully, lest he accidentally destroy everything he touched. His first great deed came when he was 18. The city of Thebes was being terrorized by a lion on Mount Cithaeron. Heracles hunted it for 50 days, and during those 50 nights, he lay with the 50 daughters of King Thespius. Some say 1 each night, others claim all 50 in a single night. Such was his vigor. He killed the lion and wore its skin as a cloak, though this is often confused with his later conquest of the Nemean lion. As reward for saving Thebes from another threat, defeating the minions who had been demanding tribute, King Creon gave Heracles his daughter Megara in marriage. They had 3 children, some say as many as 8, and for a time Heracles knew happiness. But Hera's hatred had not diminished. She waited until Heracles was at the height of his contentment, then struck him with madness. In his divinely induced insanity, Heracles saw his children as enemies, perhaps as giants or monsters, and he killed them all with his bow. Some versions say he killed Megara too, others that she survived to remarry. When the madness cleared and Heracles saw what he had done, his anguish was beyond description. He contemplated suicide, but Theseus, his friend and fellow hero, convinced him to seek purification instead. The oracle at Delphi, speaking with Apollo's voice, told him he must serve King Eurystheus of Tiryns for 12 years and perform whatever labors were demanded of him. Eurystheus was Heracles' cousin, a weak and cowardly man who had been born first only because Hera had delayed Heracles' birth. By rights, Heracles should have been king, but fate and divine interference had reversed their positions. Now, this lesser man would command the greatest hero of the age. The 12 labors that followed were supposedly impossible tasks, designed by Eurystheus, with Hera whispering suggestions to destroy Heracles. First came the Nemean lion, a beast whose hide could not be pierced by any weapon. Heracles tracked it to its cave, which had 2 entrances. He blocked one and entered through the other, cornering the beast. When his arrows bounced harmlessly off its golden fur, he wrestled it with his bare hands, eventually strangling it as he had the serpents in his crib. He used the lion's own claws, the only things sharp enough to skin it, and thereafter wore its hide as armor. The second labor was the Lernaean Hydra, a serpentine monster with multiple heads, some say 9, others 50, still others 100. For every head cut off, 2 would grow back. The Hydra's breath was poisonous, its blood was acid, and one of its heads was immortal. Heracles enlisted the help of his nephew Iolaus, who cauterized each neck stump with a torch as Heracles severed the heads, preventing regeneration. The immortal head he cut off and buried under a massive boulder. He dipped his arrows in the Hydra's blood, making them lethally poisonous, a decision that would have consequences throughout his life and even cause his death. Third came the Ceryneian hind, a deer sacred to Artemis, with golden antlers and bronze hooves, swift as the wind. Heracles pursued it for a full year, following it through Arcadia, across Greece, some say as far as the land of the Hyperboreans beyond the north wind. Finally, he caught it while it slept, or perhaps wounded it slightly with an arrow, though he had to beg Artemis's forgiveness for touching her sacred animal. The Erymanthian boar was fourth, a creature of monstrous size that terrorized the foothills of Mount Erymanthos. Heracles drove it into deep snow where it floundered, then bound it and carried it on his shoulders back to Eurystheus. The king was so terrified when he saw Heracles approaching with the live boar that he hid in a large bronze jar he had commissioned for just such emergencies. The fifth labor seemed different from the others, cleaning the Augean stables in a single day. King Augeas owned thousands of cattle, and their stables hadn't been cleaned in 30 years. The filth was so deep and so solid that it seemed impossible for any man to clear it. But Heracles, using his mind as well as his muscles, diverted 2 rivers to flow through the stables, washing them clean. Augeas, who had promised Heracles 1/10 of his cattle if he succeeded, refused to pay when he learned Heracles was performing a labor for Eurystheus. This betrayal would later lead to war. The 6th labor took him to Stymphalos, where a flock of man-eating birds with bronze beaks and metallic feathers they could launch like arrows terrorized the countryside. Heracles used bronze castanets given to him by Athena, created by Hephaestus, whose noise frightened the birds into flight. As they rose into the air, he shot them down with his poisoned arrows. For the 7th labor, Heracles had to capture the Cretan bull. This was the same magnificent bull that Poseidon had sent to King Minos, the one that had sired the Minotaur. The bull had broken free and was ravaging the countryside of Crete. Heracles wrestled it into submission and rode it across the sea back to Greece, presenting it to Eurystheus, who immediately released it. The bull would wander to Marathon, where Theseus would later capture it again. The 8th labor involved the mares of Diomedes, 4 horses that fed on human flesh. Diomedes, king of Thrace, fed them the strangers who came to his kingdom. Heracles fed Diomedes to his own horses, which seemed to calm their savage nature, then brought them back to Eurystheus. They were later released and eventually killed by wild beasts on Mount Olympus, or perhaps founded a line of swift but temperamental horses. For the 9th labor, Eurystheus, prompted by his daughter Admete, who coveted it, demanded the girdle of Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons. The Amazons were warrior women who lived without men, meeting them only to procreate, keeping daughters and sending away or killing sons. Hippolyta, their queen, wore a golden girdle given to her by her father Ares, god of war. When Heracles arrived at Themyscira, the Amazon capital on the Black Sea, Hippolyta received him peacefully. She was impressed by his reputation and, some say, attracted to him. She agreed to give him the girdle willingly. But Hera, disguised as an Amazon, spread rumors that Heracles intended to kidnap their queen. The Amazons attacked, and in the battle that followed, Heracles killed Hippolyta, taking the girdle from her corpse. Some versions say she survived and later married Theseus, but most agree she died there, another victim of Hera's schemes. The 10th labor sent Heracles to the far west to retrieve the cattle of Geryon. Geryon was a giant with 3 bodies joined at the waist, or perhaps 3 heads, or 6 arms. The stories vary. He lived on the island of Erythea, beyond the edge of the known world, where the sun set into the ocean. To reach him, Heracles had to cross the Libyan desert, where the heat was so intense that he shot an arrow at Helios, the sun god, in frustration. Helios, amused by his audacity, lent him the golden cup in which the sun sailed back to the east each night after setting. On Erythea, Heracles killed Orthrus, Geryon's 2-headed dog, brother to Cerberus, and Eurytion, the herdsman. When Geryon came to avenge them, Heracles shot him through all 3 bodies with a single arrow. Driving the cattle back to Greece was an adventure in itself, taking him through Spain, France, and Italy, leaving traces of his passage that locals would claim for generations. The 11th labor required the apples of the Hesperides, golden fruit from a tree given to Hera as a wedding gift. The tree grew in a garden at the edge of the world, tended by the Hesperides, daughters of the evening, and guarded by Ladon, a 100-headed dragon that never slept. Heracles first had to find the garden, which required capturing Nereus, the shape-shifting old man of the sea, and holding him despite his transformations until he revealed the location. On his way, Heracles found Prometheus still chained to his rock, the eagle still feeding on his liver. He shot the eagle and freed the Titan, who in gratitude told him not to pick the apples himself, but to ask Atlas. Atlas, who held up the sky as punishment for fighting against Zeus, was the father of the Hesperides. Heracles offered to hold the sky while Atlas fetched the apples. When Atlas returned with the golden fruit, he suggested that he could deliver them to Eurystheus himself, clearly planning to leave Heracles holding the sky forever. Heracles pretended to agree, but asked Atlas to take the burden back for just a moment while he adjusted his cloak as padding. Once Atlas resumed his burden, Heracles took the apples and left, though some say he first placed pillars at the Strait of Gibraltar to help support the sky. The 12th and final labor was the most daunting: to bring back Cerberus, the 3-headed hound that guarded the gates of the underworld. No living mortal had ever entered Hades' realm and returned. Heracles first underwent initiation into the Eleusinian mysteries to prepare his soul for the journey. Then, guided by Hermes and Athena, he descended through the cave at Taenarum. The shades of the dead fled before him, all except Meleager and the Gorgon Medusa. When he drew his sword against Medusa, Hermes reminded him she was just an empty phantom. He found Theseus and Pirithous imprisoned on the chairs of forgetfulness for trying to kidnap Persephone. He freed Theseus, but when he tried to free Pirithous, the earth shook in warning and he had to leave him. Finally, Heracles stood before Hades himself. The Lord of the Dead, perhaps impressed by his audacity, perhaps moved by respect for his nephew, agreed to let him take Cerberus if he could subdue the beast without weapons. Heracles wrestled the 3-headed dog, his lion skin protecting him from its teeth and its snake tail, until Cerberus submitted. He carried the beast up to the sunlight, where its drool dripping on the earth created the poisonous plant aconite. Eurystheus, hiding in his bronze jar again, ordered him to return it immediately. With the labors complete, Heracles was free from his servitude, but his story was far from over. He would have many more adventures, joining the Argonauts, sacking Troy, fighting the gods themselves when Hera again drove him mad. His death, when it came, was both tragic and transcendent. He had married Deianira after winning her from the river god Achelous. Years later, the centaur Nessus tried to rape her while carrying her across a river. Heracles shot him with a poisoned arrow, and as Nessus died, he told Deianira that his blood would work as a love potion if Heracles' affections ever strayed. She collected it, not knowing it was contaminated with Hydra venom. When Heracles later fell in love with Iole, Deianira sent him a robe soaked in what she thought was a love charm. The moment the robe touched his skin, The Hydra's poison began burning through his flesh. He tried to tear it off, but it had fused to his body, and his skin came away with it. In agony beyond description, Heracles had himself carried to Mount Oeta, where he built his own funeral pyre. No one would light it until finally Philoctetes, or perhaps his father Poeas, agreed in exchange for Heracles' bow and poisoned arrows. As the flames consumed his mortal body, Zeus sent a cloud to carry his divine essence to Olympus. There, reconciled at last with Hera, he married her daughter Hebe, goddess of youth, and became the god of strength and heroic endeavor. The only mortal to achieve full godhood through his deeds, Heracles became proof that excellence and suffering could elevate even a half-blood to divinity. But let us turn now to another great quest, one that involved many heroes, the voyage of the Argonauts. Jason's story began before his birth, with a prophecy and a usurpation. His father, Aeson, was the rightful king of Iolcus, but his half-brother Peleus seized the throne. An oracle warned Peleus to beware a man wearing one sandal. So when Jason arrived in the city with 1 foot bare, having lost his sandal helping an old woman, actually Hera in disguise, across a river, Peleus knew his doom approached. Jason had been raised in secret by Chiron the centaur, learning wisdom and warfare in equal measure. Now grown, he came to claim his birthright, but Peleus was cunning. "I will gladly give you the throne," he said, "but first you must lift a curse from our land by retrieving the golden fleece from Colchis." The golden fleece came from the ram that had saved Phrixus and Helle, children threatened by their stepmother. The ram, sent by their birth mother Nephele, had golden wool and could fly. Helle fell into the sea during their escape, hence the Hellespont. But Phrixus reached Colchis, where he sacrificed the ram to Zeus and gave its fleece to King Aeetes, who hung it in a grove sacred to Ares, guarded by a dragon that never slept. Peleus believed the quest impossible, a death sentence disguised as a heroic challenge. But Jason accepted, and word of his quest spread throughout Greece. Heroes came from every corner of the land to join him. Heracles was there, taking a break from his labors. Orpheus came, whose music could charm stones and tame wild beasts. Castor and Polydeuces, the twin sons of Leda, one mortal, one divine. Atalanta, the huntress who had been raised by bears, the only woman among them. Peleus, who would father Achilles. Telamon, who would father Ajax. And many more, perhaps 50 in all, each a hero in their own right. The ship itself was a wonder, built by Argus with Athena's help. In its prow was set a beam from the sacred oak of Dodona, which could speak prophecy. They called the ship Argo, and themselves the Argonauts. Their journey to Colchis was filled with adventures. On Lemnos, they found an island populated only by women who had killed their husbands for taking Thracian concubines. The Argonauts stayed for a year, repopulating the island, until Heracles, who had remained on the ship, shamed them into continuing. They fought the 6-armed giants of Bear Mountain, killing them in a tragic case of mistaken identity when they attacked at night. In Mysia, Heracles' young lover Hylas was pulled into a spring by nymphs who fell in love with his beauty. Heracles searched for him so frantically that the Argonauts were forced to sail without him, perhaps the gods' way of removing him, as his strength would have made the quest too easy. They encountered Phineus, a blind prophet tormented by harpies who befouled his food whenever he tried to eat. The winged sons of Boreas drove off the harpies, and in gratitude, Phineus told them how to pass through the simple gades, the clashing rocks. These massive rocks smashed together whenever anything tried to pass between them. Following Phineus's advice, they released a dove first. The rocks clashed, clipping only the bird's tail feathers. As the rocks separated, the Argonauts rowed with all their might, Athena herself giving the ship a final push that carried them through just as the rocks crashed together again, taking only the ship's stern ornament. After passing through, the rocks became fixed in place forever, their purpose fulfilled. Finally, they reached Colchis on the eastern shore of the Black Sea. King Aeetes, son of Helios, received them with suspicion. He agreed to give Jason the fleece if he could complete certain tasks: yoke the Kalkatauroi, fire-breathing bulls with bronze hooves, plow a field with them, and sow the field with dragon's teeth from which armed warriors would spring. It seemed impossible, but Hera and Aphrodite had a plan. They sent Eros to strike Medea, Aeetes' daughter, with love for Jason. Medea was a priestess of Hecate, skilled in magic and potions, a woman of power in her own right. Torn between loyalty to her father and passion for the stranger, she chose love, or perhaps the gods chose for her. She gave Jason a potion that would protect him from fire and bronze, told him how to defeat the earth-born warriors, throw a stone among them so they would fight each other. With her help, Jason completed the tasks, but Aeetes refused to honor his bargain, planning to burn the Argo and kill its crew. That night, Medea led Jason to the grove where the golden fleece hung, blazing like a second sun in the darkness. The dragon that guarded it was magnificent and terrible, its scales like armor, its eyes never closing. Medea sang spells of sleep, dripping potions on its eyes until the great beast slumbered for the first time in its existence. Jason seized the fleece, and they fled to the Argo. As they sailed away, Aeetes' ships pursued them. In one of the most cold-blooded acts in all mythology, Medea killed her own brother Absyrtus, either a child she brought aboard or a grown man leading the pursuit. She dismembered him and threw the pieces into the sea, knowing her father would have to stop to collect them for proper burial. This delay allowed the Argonauts to escape, though the murder would haunt them. The journey home was even longer than the voyage out. Different storytellers described different routes up the Danube, around Europe, through rivers that connected seas in ways that defied geography. They were purified by Circe, Medea's aunt, for the murder of Absyrtus. They passed the Sirens, where Orpheus's music drowned out their deadly song. They navigated between Scylla and Charybdis, losing several men to the six-headed monster. They were helped by the sea nymph Thetis and her sisters past the wandering rocks. On Crete, they encountered Talos, the bronze giant who guarded the island, throwing boulders at approaching ships. Medea destroyed him with her magic, or perhaps by pulling out the bronze nail that kept his ichor, his divine blood, from leaking out. When they finally returned to Iolcus, they found that Peleus had forced Jason's father to commit suicide and killed his mother and infant brother. Medea convinced Peleus's daughters that she could make their father young again, demonstrating by cutting up an old ram and boiling it with herbs until a lamb emerged. The daughters, desperate to restore their father's youth, killed Peleus and cut him into pieces as instructed. But Medea withheld the magic herbs, and Peleus remained very much dead, his blood on his own daughter's hands. The murder was perfect revenge, but it also made Jason and Medea outcasts. They fled to Corinth, where they lived for 10 years and had children. Some say 2 boys, others say 2 boys and a girl. But Jason, perhaps forgetting all he owed Medea, or perhaps simply ambitious for a throne he could not inherit, decided to marry Glauce, the daughter of King Creon of Corinth. He argued that it was for their children's benefit to give them legitimate royal siblings. Medea's rage was volcanic. This woman who had betrayed her father, killed her brother, left her homeland, and stained her hands with blood for Jason. He was abandoning her for a younger princess. She sent Glauce a wedding gift, a beautiful robe and golden crown, both soaked in poison. When the girl put them on, they burst into flames that could not be extinguished. Creon, trying to save his daughter, was also consumed. Then, in the most horrific act of revenge, Medea killed her own children. Some say to save them from the Corinthians' vengeance, others that it was pure spite, to leave Jason with nothing. She escaped in a chariot drawn by dragons, sent by her grandfather Helios. Jason died years later, alone and forgotten, when a rotting beam from the Argo fell and crushed his skull. An ignominious end for a hero who had won the Golden Fleece but lost everything else. These individual heroes and their quests were magnificent, but they pale before the great war that would define the age of heroes, the Trojan War. Odysseus himself tried to avoid the war by feigning madness, plowing his fields with salt and a mixed team of ox and donkey. But Palamedes placed Odysseus's infant son Telemachus in front of the plow, and Odysseus swerved to avoid him, proving his sanity. He would never forgive Palamedes for this, later engineering his death with a false accusation of treason. The Greek fleet, over 1,000 ships, gathered at Aulis, but the winds would not come to carry them to Troy. Calchas, the prophet, revealed that Artemis was angry. Agamemnon had boasted he was a better hunter than the goddess herself. She demanded the sacrifice of his daughter Iphigenia. Agamemnon lured his daughter to Aulis with the promise that she would marry Achilles. Instead, she was sacrificed on the altar, though some say Artemis substituted a deer at the last moment and spirited the girl away to serve as her priestess. Clytemnestra never forgave her husband for this murder. The winds came and the fleet sailed for Troy. The war would last 10 years, though the Iliad, Homer's great epic, covers only a few weeks in the final year. For 9 years, the Greeks besieged Troy without success. The walls built by Apollo and Poseidon were impregnable. The Greeks raided the surrounding countryside for supplies and slaves. It was during one of these raids that Achilles captured Briseis, a princess of Lyrnessus, who became his prize. In the 10th year, a plague struck the Greek camp. Calchas revealed that Apollo was punishing them because Agamemnon had taken Chryseis, daughter of one of Apollo's priests, as his own prize. Agamemnon reluctantly returned her, but demanded compensation. He took Briseis from Achilles. Achilles' rage at this dishonor was terrible. He withdrew from the fighting, and with him went his Myrmidons, the fearsome warriors he commanded. He prayed to his mother Thetis, begging her to ask Zeus to let the Trojans win, until Agamemnon understood what he had lost by insulting the greatest warrior. Thetis went to Olympus, and Zeus, who owed her a favor, agreed. With Achilles absent, the tide of war turned. Hector, eldest son of Priam and greatest of the Trojan warriors, drove the Greeks back to their ships. He killed Patroclus, Achilles' closest companion, his friend, perhaps his cousin, maybe his lover. The myths are deliberately ambiguous. Patroclus had borrowed Achilles' armor and led the Myrmidons into battle, hoping to save the Greeks. But he pushed too far, and Apollo himself struck him, dazing him so Hector could deliver the killing blow. When Achilles learned of Patroclus' death, his grief transcended mortal emotion. His cry of anguish was heard across the entire battlefield, and his mother rose from the sea, knowing what this meant. She begged him not to return to battle, for his fate was tied to Hector's. Kill Hector, and he would die soon after. But Achilles cared nothing for his own life anymore. Vengeance was all that mattered. Thetis went to Hephaestus and begged him to forge new armor for her son, since Patroclus had died wearing the old. The smith god created armor of surpassing beauty and strength, most famously a shield decorated with images of the entire cosmos, the earth, the sea, the sky, cities at peace and war, fields being plowed, vineyards heavy with grapes, all of human life rendered in bronze and gold and silver. Wearing this divine armor, Achilles returned to battle like a force of nature. He killed Trojans by the hundreds, filling the river Scamander with so many bodies that the river god himself rose up to protest. Nothing could stand against him. When he finally faced Hector beneath the walls of Troy, the Trojan hero ran. 3 times they circled the city, Hector fleeing, Achilles pursuing, while both armies watched in silence. The gods watched too, and Zeus weighed their fates on his golden scales. Hector's scale sank, marking his doom, and Apollo, who had protected him until then, withdrew. Athena, disguised as Hector's brother, tricked him into making a stand. The fight was brief. Achilles' spear pierced Hector's throat. As he died, Hector begged Achilles to return his body to his family for proper burial. Achilles refused. He tied Hector's corpse to his chariot and dragged it around Troy's walls, then around Patroclus's tomb, day after day, defiling it. But the gods preserved the body from corruption, and finally, Zeus sent Thetis to command Achilles to accept ransom. Old King Priam came alone to Achilles' tent, guided by Hermes, and kissed the hands that had killed his son. He begged for Hector's body, and Achilles, seeing in Priam his own father whom he would never see again, wept. They wept together, enemy and enemy, both knowing that grief transcends enmity. Achilles returned Hector's body, and the Iliad ends with Hector's funeral, though the war was far from over. Achilles himself died soon after, shot in his vulnerable heel by Paris with an arrow guided by Apollo. Some say Paris shot him, others that Apollo himself drew the bow. Either way, the greatest warrior of the age fell to an arrow, not in glorious single combat, but from a distance. His armor was awarded to Odysseus rather than Ajax, who had saved Achilles' body. Ajax, driven mad by the insult, slaughtered a flock of sheep thinking they were Greek leaders, then killed himself in shame when sanity returned. The Greeks, unable to breach Troy's walls, resorted to trickery. Odysseus conceived the idea of the wooden horse. They built an enormous hollow horse and hid their best warriors inside. The rest of the Greeks burned their camp and sailed away, though only to the nearby island of Tenedos. The Trojans found the horse and a Greek prisoner named Sinon, who told them it was an offering to Athena. He claimed the Greeks had fled, and if the Trojans brought the horse into their city, they would have Athena's protection forever. Cassandra, Priam's daughter who had been cursed by Apollo to speak true prophecies that no one would believe, warned them it was a trick. Laocoon, a priest, warned them too, saying, "I fear Greeks even bearing gifts," and threw a spear at the horse. But then serpents emerged from the sea and killed Laocoon and his sons, sent by Athena or Poseidon, who supported the Greeks. The Trojans, taking this as a sign, dragged the horse inside. That night, the warriors emerged. They opened the gates, and the Greek army, which had sailed back under cover of darkness, poured into the city. Troy burned. The massacre was total and terrible. King Priam was killed on the altar of Zeus by Neoptolemus, Achilles' son. Hector's infant son, Astyanax, was thrown from the walls to prevent him from growing up to avenge his father. Cassandra was raped by Ajax the Lesser in Athena's temple. Earning the goddess's wrath, she would drown him on his voyage home. Hector's widow Andromache became Neoptolemus's slave. Helen was reclaimed by Menelaus, who intended to kill her but was overcome again by her beauty. Only a few Trojans escaped. Aeneas, carrying his father on his back and leading his son by the hand, fled the burning city. His descendants would eventually found Rome, or so Virgil would later claim. The Greek victors sailed home, but the gods were not finished with them. The Greek victors sailed home, but the gods were not finished with them. The sack of Troy had been too brutal, too impious. Temples had been violated, altars defiled with blood, suppliants murdered while seeking divine protection. Poseidon and Athena, who had supported the Greeks throughout the war, now turned against them. They sent storms that scattered the fleet, shipwrecking and drowning many who had survived 10 years of warfare. Agamemnon made it home to Mycenae, only to be murdered in his bath by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus. She claimed it was justice for Iphigenia, and perhaps it was, but it set in motion another cycle of vengeance. Their son Orestes would later kill both his mother and Aegisthus, pursued thereafter by the Furies until Athena herself established a court to judge him. But the most famous journey home was that of Odysseus, a voyage that would take 10 years, as long as the war itself. Homer's Odyssey tells this tale, perhaps the most beloved story in all of Greek literature. Odysseus left Troy with 12 ships, all his men alive. By the time he reached home, he would be alone. First, they raided the Cicones, losing men in a counterattack, a reminder that not all suffering is divinely ordained. Sometimes we bring it on ourselves. Then storms drove them to the land of the Lotus Eaters, where the inhabitants ate a flower that made them forget their homes and families. Several of Odysseus's men ate the lotus and had to be dragged back to the ships by force. Next came the island of the Cyclopes, those one-eyed giants, children of Poseidon. Odysseus and 12 men explored a cave, finding it full of cheese and sheep. The cave belonged to Polyphemus, and when he returned, he trapped them inside by blocking the entrance with a boulder no man could move. He ate 2 men for dinner, 2 more for breakfast. Odysseus conceived a plan. He offered the Cyclops wine, strong and undiluted, getting him drunk. When Polyphemus asked his name, Odysseus said, "Nobody." Then, while the giants slept, they heated a wooden stake in the fire and drove it into his single eye. His screams brought other Cyclopes running, asking what was wrong. "Nobody is killing me," Polyphemus roared, so they assumed he was mad or ill and left. In the morning, Polyphemus, now blind, removed the boulder to let his sheep out, feeling each one to make sure no men escaped. But Odysseus had tied his men beneath the sheep's bellies, and they escaped. As they sailed away, Odysseus's pride got the better of him. He shouted back his real name, taunting the blinded giant. Polyphemus prayed to his father Poseidon to curse Odysseus, that he would reach home late, on a strange ship, alone, and find trouble in his house. Poseidon heard, and the curse would come to pass. The next stop brought them to Aeolus, keeper of the winds, who gave Odysseus a bag containing all the winds except the west wind that would blow them home. For 9 days they sailed, and Ithaca was in sight when Odysseus finally fell asleep. His men, thinking the bag contained gold that Odysseus wasn't sharing, opened it. All the winds escaped, blowing them back to Aeolus, who refused to help them again. Clearly, the gods hated them. They came to the land of the Laestrygonians, giant cannibals who destroyed 11 of the 12 ships, eating their crews. Only Odysseus's ship escaped. On the island of Aea, they met Circe, a goddess and witch, daughter of Helios. She turned half of Odysseus's men into pigs. Hermes gave Odysseus a magical herb called moly that protected him from her magic. When her spells failed, Circe recognized him as the man prophesied to resist her, and she became his lover. They stayed a year, and she bore him sons, though Homer doesn't mention this. When they finally left, Circe advised him to visit the underworld to consult the shade of Tiresias, the blind prophet. At the edge of the world, where the sun never shines, Odysseus dug a pit and poured libations of milk, honey, wine, and blood. The shades of the dead gathered, drawn by the blood, for only by drinking it could they regain enough substance to speak. He saw his mother, Anticlea, who had died of grief, waiting for him. He saw Agamemnon, who warned him about treacherous wives. He saw Achilles, who said he would rather be a slave among the living than king among the dead, though other versions have him content in Elysium. Tiresias told him what lay ahead. He would lose all his men, he would find suitors in his house, and after he reclaimed his kingdom, he must make one final journey inland, carrying an oar until he found people who had never seen the sea. There he must sacrifice to Poseidon, and only then would he have peace. Returning from the underworld, they passed the sirens, whose song lured sailors to their deaths on the rocks. Odysseus had himself tied to the mast so he could hear their song safely, while his men rowed with their ears plugged with wax. The sirens sang of knowledge, of everything that had happened at Troy, of all things past and future. Odysseus begged to be released, but his men, unable to hear him, rowed on. Next, they had to pass between Scylla and Charybdis. Scylla was a six-headed monster who lived in a cliff, each head able to snatch a sailor from passing ships. Charybdis was a whirlpool that could swallow entire ships. Circe had advised him to sail closer to Scylla, losing 6 men rather than risk the entire ship to Charybdis. Odysseus followed her advice, though he didn't tell his men, and watched helplessly as 6 of his companions were devoured. They reached the island of Thrinacia, where Helios kept his sacred cattle. Tiresias and Circe had both warned him not to harm these cattle. But trapped on the island by unfavorable winds, his men grew hungry. While Odysseus slept, they slaughtered several cattle, offering prayers and promises they couldn't keep. When Helios learned what had happened, he demanded Zeus punish them, or he would take his light to the underworld and shine only for the dead. Zeus struck their ship with a thunderbolt as soon as they sailed. All the men drowned. Only Odysseus survived, clinging to wreckage, drifting for 9 days until he washed up on Ogygia, Calypso's island. The nymph Calypso kept him there for 7 years, offering him immortality if he would stay and be her husband. But Odysseus longed for home, for his wife Penelope, for mortal life with all its brevity and pain. Finally, at Athena's urging, Zeus commanded Calypso to release him. She helped him build a raft, and he sailed once more. Poseidon, still angry, sent one final storm that destroyed the raft. Odysseus would have drowned if the sea nymph Ino hadn't given him her veil for protection. He swam for 2 days and nights until he reached the island of the Phaeacians. These people, beloved of the gods, received him kindly. Their princess, Nausicaa, found him on the beach and brought him to her father's palace. There, at a feast, Odysseus finally revealed his identity and told the story of his wanderings. The Phaeacians, moved by his tale, gave him a ship and treasure and sailed him home to Ithaca while he slept. He had been gone 20 years, 10 fighting at Troy, 10 trying to return. In his absence, his house had been overrun by suitors, men who sought to marry Penelope and claim his kingdom. They had taken over his palace, feasting on his livestock, drinking his wine, abusing his servants. There were over 100 of them, each convinced Odysseus was dead. Penelope had held them off with cunning worthy of her husband. She promised to choose a suitor when she finished weaving a funeral shroud for Odysseus's father, Laertes. Each day she wove, and each night she secretly unraveled her work. For 3 years this deception held, until one of her maids betrayed her. Now the suitors pressed her harder, demanding she choose. Odysseus landed on Ithaca disguised as a beggar, transformed by Athena so that even his own family wouldn't recognize him. He went first to the hut of Eumaeus, his loyal swineherd, who welcomed the stranger with true hospitality despite his own poverty. There he learned of the suitors' depredations, of Penelope's faithfulness, of his son Telemachus, who had grown to manhood in his absence. Telemachus returned from his own journey. He had been seeking news of his father in Pylos and Sparta. Athena restored Odysseus's appearance briefly, and father and son reunited, weeping together. They planned their revenge. Odysseus, disguised again as a beggar, entered his own palace. The suitors mocked him, throwing food and footstools. Only his old dog Argos recognized him. The hound had waited 20 years for his master's return, and having seen him at last, laid down and died. Penelope, who didn't recognize him, announced a contest. She would marry whoever could string Odysseus's great bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads. The suitors tried and failed. None could even string the bow. The beggar asked to try. The suitors laughed, but Penelope allowed it. Odysseus strung the bow as easily as a musician strings a lyre, and shot the arrow through all 12 axes. Then he turned the bow on the suitors. With Telemachus, Eumaeus, and another loyal servant, he slaughtered them all. The palace ran red with blood. 12 maids who had betrayed the household were hanged. The disloyal goat-herd Melanthius was mutilated and left to die. Finally, Odysseus revealed himself to Penelope, but she was cautious after 20 years. How could she be certain this was truly her husband? She tested him, mentioning that she had moved their bed. Odysseus reacted with anger. The bed couldn't be moved. He had built it himself around a living olive tree, one post carved from the tree's trunk, rooted in the earth. Only the true Odysseus would know this secret. Penelope fell into his arms, and they wept together, reunited at last. But even then, peace was not assured. The families of the dead suitors sought vengeance. Only Athena's intervention prevented further bloodshed, establishing a truce that would allow Odysseus to rule in peace. The Odyssey ends with this reconciliation, though other stories say Odysseus eventually made the journey Tiresias prophesied, planting his oar where people mistook it for a winnowing fan, far from the sea. As we near the end of our journey through Greek mythology, let us step back and consider what these stories meant, what they still mean. The Greeks did not have sacred scriptures in the way some religions do. Their myths were not dogma but stories told and retold, each teller adding nuances, changing details, exploring different possibilities. Homer and Hesiod gave us our earliest written versions, but these stories lived in oral tradition long before and continued to evolve long after. What did the Greeks learn from these tales? Perhaps first, that the universe is not ordered around human comfort or justice. The gods are powerful, but not omnipotent, wise but not all-knowing, and certainly not paragons of morality. They have their own desires, their own conflicts, their own petty jealousies. Zeus, king of gods, cannot even control his own household, his marriage a constant battlefield. The gods intervene in mortal affairs, not from altruism, but from self-interest, favoritism, old grudges, or simple whim. Yet they demand respect, honor, proper sacrifice. The concept of hubris, overweening pride, the presumption that one can exceed one's proper place, runs through these myths like a thread of gold through dark cloth. Arachne boasted she could weave better than Athena and was transformed into a spider, doomed to weave forever. Niobe claimed her 14 children made her greater than Leto, who had only 2. Apollo and Artemis killed all 14, and Niobe wept until she turned to stone. Marsyas challenged Apollo to a musical contest and was flayed alive when he lost. Bellerophon tried to ride Pegasus to Olympus itself and was thrown down, spending the rest of his life as a blind, limping wanderer. The message seems clear. Know your place, respect the gods, don't reach too high. Yet the Greeks also celebrated those who pushed boundaries, who used cleverness to overcome obstacles, who achieved glory even at the cost of their lives. Odysseus deceived gods and monsters alike with his cunning. Prometheus defied Zeus himself out of compassion for humanity. Achilles chose a short, glorious life over a long, forgotten one. The myths contain a tension between accepting fate and striving against it, between humility before the gods and the drive for excellence that makes us human. This tension was never resolved because it cannot be resolved. It is the human condition itself. The Greeks also understood that knowledge brings suffering. Cassandra could see the future, but could never be believed. Tiresias was blinded when he saw what he shouldn't. Oedipus's relentless pursuit of truth destroyed him. The oracle at Delphi bore the inscription, "Know thyself," but the myths suggest that self-knowledge often comes with a terrible price. Family relationships in Greek myth are almost uniformly dysfunctional. Cronus devoured his children. Zeus swallowed his first wife and repeatedly betrayed his subsequent one. Children kill parents. Parents sacrifice children. Siblings betray siblings. The house of Atreus, Agamemnon's family, suffered curse after curse. Tantalus served his son as food to the gods. Pelops won his bride through treachery and murder. Atreus fed his brother's children to him. Agamemnon sacrificed his daughter. Clytemnestra murdered her husband. Orestes killed his mother. Each generation's crimes poisoned the next until Athena intervened to break the cycle. Perhaps these stories served as warnings, showing what happens when family bonds are violated, when proper order is overturned. Or perhaps they simply reflected the Greeks' understanding that families are where we first learn about power, jealousy, love, and betrayal. The relationship between mortals and immortals was complex and often troubling. Gods took mortal lovers, producing heroes and demigods, but these children rarely fared well. Heracles was driven mad, Perseus was exiled, Achilles died young. Being noticed by the gods was dangerous. Better to live quietly, honor them properly, but never draw their full attention. Yet the myths also suggest that mortality itself gives meaning to human life. When Achilles chose glory over longevity, when Odysseus refused Calypso's offer of immortality, they affirmed that a mortal life fully lived is worth more than an immortal existence as a god's toy. The gods themselves envied mortals in some ways. They could never truly risk anything, never face permanent consequences, never know the poignancy of limited time. Zeus might fear being overthrown, but he could not die. Achilles could die, and that made his choice to fight meaningful in a way divine conflicts never quite achieved. The myths also explored the nature of fate and free will, though they never settled the question. The fates spun, measured, and cut the thread of each life, and even Zeus could not override their decrees, or could he? Different stories gave different answers. Prophecies in Greek myth always came true, but often in unexpected ways. Oedipus's father tried to avoid the prophecy that his son would kill him, and his very attempt to avoid it set the events in motion. The oracle told Cronus his son would overthrow him, and by trying to prevent it, he guaranteed it would happen. Yet heroes still made choices, still bore responsibility for their actions. Agamemnon chose to sacrifice Iphigenia. Achilles chose to return to battle knowing it would lead to his death. Odysseus chose to reveal his name to Polyphemus, bringing Poseidon's curse upon himself. Perhaps the Greek understanding was that we move within the constraints of fate, but still have agency in how we respond, what kind of person we choose to be. The afterlife in Greek mythology was generally bleak. Most souls went to Hades, existing as pale shadows in a gray, joyless underworld. Only the greatest heroes might reach Elysium, the blessed isles where eternal spring reigned. The worst sinners went to Tartarus for eternal punishment. Tantalus stood forever in a pool that receded when he tried to drink, beneath fruit trees that pulled back when he reached for them, eternally tantalized. Sisyphus pushed his boulder up a hill only to watch it roll down again, forever. Ixion was bound to a flaming wheel that spun eternally. The Danaids, who murdered their husbands on their wedding night, had to fill leaky jars with water forever. These punishments were not mere torture, but symbolic. They reflected the nature of the crime. Tantalus had served his son as food to the gods, so he could never be satisfied. Sisyphus, who had cheated death twice through cleverness, was given pointless labor. The punishments fit the crimes in ways that revealed Greek thinking about justice and cosmic order. Women in Greek myths occupied a complex position. They could be powerful. Medea, Circe, and Calypso wielded magic that even heroes feared. They could be clever. Penelope matched Odysseus in cunning. Ariadne saved Theseus. They could be dangerous. Helen's beauty launched the Trojan War. The Furies pursued kinslayers with relentless fury. But they were also frequently victims. Persephone was abducted. Cassandra was cursed and later raped. Medusa was transformed for being violated in Athena's temple. The double standard was stark. Zeus's infidelities were countless, but Hera's jealousy was directed at his victims rather than at him. Yet even here, the myths contain nuance. Clytemnestra murdered her husband, but had reasons. He had sacrificed their daughter and brought home a concubine. Medea's vengeance was horrific, but understandable given her betrayal. The myths don't excuse these actions, but they don't simplify them either. Greek mythology also contained creation myths beyond the grand cosmogony we began with. The creation of specific things, seasons, constellations, natural features, was often explained through mythic transformation. Persephone's abduction by Hades and her mother Demeter's grief explain the seasons. While Persephone remained in the underworld eating pomegranate seeds that bound her there, Demeter mourned, and nothing grew. This was winter. When Persephone returned for part of the year, the earth bloomed again, spring and summer. The story worked as explanation, but also as meditation on loss, on the relationship between mothers and daughters, on the inevitability of change. Many constellations had mythic origins. Orion the hunter was placed in the stars, eternally pursuing the Pleiades. The Great Bear and Little Bear were Callisto and her son, transformed by Zeus or Hera, depending on the version. Perseus, Andromeda, Cetus, the sea monster, Cassiopeia, all were placed in the heavens as a permanent memorial of their story. The Greeks looked at the night sky and saw their myths written in fire. Natural features, too, had mythic explanations. The island of Sicily was thrown by Athena onto the giant Enceladus, trapping him underneath. His writhing caused earthquakes. His breath erupted from Mount Etna. The rocks of the Cyclopes island near Sicily were explained as boulders thrown at Odysseus's fleeing ship. The narrow strait between Italy and Sicily, where Scylla and Charybdis dwelt, explained the dangerous currents there. These stories were not meant as literal science, but as ways of making the world meaningful, of connecting human experience to the landscape. The Greeks also had their trickster figures, those who operated outside normal social bounds. Hermes was the most prominent, god of boundaries and those who cross them, travelers, merchants, thieves. He was clever, but not malicious, helpful, but unreliable. His theft of Apollo's cattle on the day of his birth set the pattern. He broke rules, but charmed his way out of punishment. Prometheus was another trickster, though his tricks had greater consequences. He defied Zeus out of love for humanity, and his punishment was eternal. Odysseus embodied the mortal trickster, his cunning and flexibility allowing him to survive where stronger heroes fell. The Trojan horse was the ultimate trick, winning through deception what force could not achieve. Yet the Greeks had mixed feelings about trickery. They admired cleverness, but also valued directness and honor. Achilles was heroic partly because he was straightforward in his anger and his excellence. Odysseus was admirable but also somewhat suspect, too willing to lie and deceive. This ambivalence reflects a culture that valued both martial excellence and intellectual flexibility. The role of prophecy and oracles in Greek myth deserves consideration. The oracle at Delphi was perhaps the most famous, the Pythia breathing vapors from a chasm in the earth and speaking Apollo's cryptic truths. Kings and heroes consulted her before major decisions. Her prophecies always came true, but rarely in the way the questioner expected. When Croesus asked if he should attack Persia, the oracle said he would destroy a great empire. She didn't specify which empire, and it turned out to be his own. This pattern repeated throughout the myths. Prophecies came true through the very attempts to avoid them. Perhaps this reflected Greek anxiety about knowledge and control. We want to know the future, but knowing it doesn't give us power over it. Sometimes knowing makes things worse, as with Oedipus. The gods themselves consulted prophecies and worried about their fates. Zeus's fear of being overthrown by a son drove much of his behavior. Even the divine could not escape fate, or at least could not be certain they could. As our journey through these ancient stories draws toward its close, we might pause to consider why these myths have endured. They were ancient even to the classical Greeks, inherited from Bronze Age cultures, from Mycenaean and Minoan civilizations that rose and fell before Homer sang. Yet they remain vital today, thousands of years later, retold in countless forms. Perhaps it is because they deal with fundamental human experiences: love and jealousy, courage and fear, ambition and its costs, the search for home and meaning. The specific details are fantastical: gods and monsters, magic and miracles. But the emotional truths are universal. Every parent who has worried about their child's future understands Thetis trying to make Achilles immortal. Everyone who has felt torn between duty and desire can relate to Ariadne's choice. Anyone who has undertaken a long journey home knows something of Odysseus's yearning. The myths also give us language for experiences that are otherwise hard to articulate. We speak of Herculean tasks, Sisyphean labors, Pandora's boxes, Achilles' heels. These phrases carry entire stories within them, compressed wisdom that communicates instantly. The Greek myths influenced not just literature, but art, psychology, philosophy. Freud named his theory after Oedipus, seeing in that ancient story a pattern he believed universal. Jung found in myths the archetypes he thought structured the human unconscious. Artists, from ancient pottery painters to Renaissance masters to modern filmmakers, have found inspiration in these stories. The myths provided frameworks for understanding human nature and the cosmos. They were entertainment, certainly, but also education, philosophy, theology, history, all woven together. A Greek child learning these stories was learning what it meant to be Greek, what virtues to aspire to, what mistakes to avoid. They were learning about the gods who shaped their world and demanded their worship. They were learning their culture's shared language, the references that bound the community together. The mystery religions that existed alongside the public myths offered different answers to questions about death and meaning. The Eleusinian mysteries promised initiates a better afterlife, though what exactly they taught remains secret to this day. The Orphic mysteries, following Orpheus who had journeyed to the underworld and returned, taught reincarnation and the possibility of escaping the cycle of rebirth. These existed alongside the public myths without contradiction. The Greeks seemed comfortable holding multiple perspectives simultaneously, understanding that different contexts required different truths. The philosophers, of course, had complicated relationships with the myths. Xenophanes complained that Homer and Hesiod attributed to the gods everything shameful among mortals: theft, adultery, deceit. Plato wanted to censor the myths in his ideal city, removing stories that showed the gods behaving immorally. Yet even Plato used myths to convey truths that logic alone could not reach. His allegory of the cave, his myth of describing the afterlife. Aristotle analyzed tragedy and found in myths like Oedipus the perfect structure for drama: the reversal of fortune, the recognition, the catharsis of pity and fear. The myths shaped philosophy even as philosophy critiqued the myths. As Greece was conquered first by Rome, then converted to Christianity, the myths transformed but did not die. The Romans adopted Greek gods, giving them new names. Zeus became Jupiter, Aphrodite became Venus, Ares became Mars. They added their own stories, their own emphases, particularly around Rome's founding by Aeneas, connecting themselves to the Trojan War cycle. Early Christians saw in the myths corruption and falsehood, demons masquerading as gods. Yet Christian writers also found in them preparation for the gospel, pagan intimations of divine truth. The medieval world preserved the myths but allegorized them, seeing in Zeus's many transformations lessons about Christ's incarnation, in Hercules' labors a prefiguration of Christ's harrowing of hell. The Renaissance rediscovered the myth's original character, and artists depicted the gods with renewed enthusiasm, though safely in the classical past. The Enlightenment treated myths as primitive science, failed attempts to explain natural phenomena. The Romantics found in them deep truths about the human spirit. The 19th century's interest in comparative mythology tried to trace myths back to their Indo-European roots, or to universal patterns of human thought. Each age reinterpreted the myths according to its own preoccupations. Today, we still return to these stories. Writers retell them from new perspectives. Madeline Miller giving voice to Circe and Patroclus, Margaret Atwood to the maids Odysseus hanged. Movies and television series bring gods and heroes to new audiences. Video games let players inhabit these mythic worlds. The stories prove endlessly adaptable, endlessly relevant. Perhaps this is because they are not fixed scriptures, but living narratives, meant to be retold, reinterpreted, reimagined. Each generation finds in them what it needs. We might see in Prometheus a revolutionary hero defying tyranny, or a cautionary tale about the costs of rebellion, or a story about the price of progress and technology, or an exploration of compassion and its consequences. All these readings are possible because the myths are rich enough to support multiple interpretations. The gods themselves, in their complexity, defy simple categorization. Zeus is king and rapist, lawgiver and adulterer, protector of hospitality and violator of it. Athena is wisdom and warfare, virginal yet born from a male god, patron of heroes yet merciless to those who offend her. Aphrodite is love and lust, beauty and manipulation, laughter-loving yet capable of cruel vengeance. These contradictions are not flaws, but features. The gods are not moral exemplars, but powers to be reckoned with, forces that shape existence. They embody aspects of reality. Zeus is authority and the sky's power. Poseidon is the sea's unpredictability. Hades is death's inevitability. To honor them is to acknowledge these realities, to live in proper relationship with the world's fundamental forces. The Greek religious experience was not primarily about believing correct doctrines, but about maintaining right relationships through proper ritual. You sacrificed to the gods, poured libations, honored their festivals. You treated guests well because Zeus protected strangers. You kept your oaths because the gods punished oath-breakers. You buried the dead properly because the unburied could not rest. The myths illustrated these principles through stories, showing what happened when they were violated. They were practical guides to living in a world where divine forces were real and active. As we come to the end of our long journey through these ancient stories, let us return one final time to where we began. From chaos came order, though that order was never perfect, never complete. From the primordial darkness emerged gods and titans, locked in endless succession. From divine conflicts came the world mortals inhabited, beautiful and terrible, suffused with meaning. The myths gave the Greeks a way to understand their place in the cosmos. They were not at the center, the gods were. But neither were they insignificant. The gods noticed them, desired them, feared them, needed their worship. Heroes could achieve glory that echoed through generations. Even ordinary mortals mattered in the vast scope of existence. The myths also provided comfort in the face of life's hardships. When someone died young, there were stories of mortals the gods loved and took to Olympus. When disaster struck, there were explanations involving divine will rather than meaningless chance. When excellence emerged, there were stories of heroes to provide models and inspiration. Yet the myths never promised easy answers or happy endings. Heroes won glory, but died young. Love led to tragedy as often as fulfillment. Justice was meted out by gods who were themselves unjust. Virtue did not guarantee reward, nor vice punishment. The myths were honest about the hardness of existence, even as they found meaning and beauty within that hardness. Perhaps that is part of their enduring power. They do not offer false comfort or simplistic morality. They present a complex world where courage, cunning, and honor matter, but do not guarantee success. Where the gods are powerful, but not all-powerful. Present, but not predictable. Where fate and free will dance together in patterns we can never quite decipher. Where death waits for everyone, but glory and memory can transcend it. And so these stories have traveled through millennia, crossing cultures and languages, adapting to new contexts while retaining their essential character. From oral traditions around Bronze Age fires to written texts in classical Athens. From Roman adaptations to Christian allegories to Renaissance celebrations. From scholarly studies to children's books to blockbuster films. The gods and heroes of ancient Greece continue to speak to us, not because we believe in them as the ancient Greeks did, but because the human experiences they embody remain constant. We still struggle with pride and humility. We still seek meaning in suffering. We still wonder about fate and choice. We still long for home, for love, for glory. We still face monsters, though ours wear different faces. We still undertake quests, though our fleeces are golden in different ways. And so, let us rest now, having journeyed from the void of chaos to the halls of Olympus, from the age of Titans to the age of heroes, from Troy's burning towers to Ithaca's welcoming shores. Close your eyes and let these ancient stories settle into your mind like stars finding their places in the night sky. The Greeks gazed at those same stars thousands of years ago and saw stories written in light. Perseus and Andromeda, Orion and the Pleiades, the great bears wheeling around the pole. The constellations remain, the stories endure, and we are connected across the centuries by shared wonder at the mystery and meaning of existence. May you rest well, wrapped in these old tales, as generations before you have rested, finding in mythology a mirror for the soul and a map for the journey we all undertake through this brief and beautiful life. The gods may sleep or may be watching. The heroes have long since turned to dust, their deeds preserved only in memory and song. But the stories live on, passed from voice to voice, from age to age. And in the telling and retelling, something essential about what it means to be human is preserved and passed forward. Sleep now, and perhaps you will dream of gods and heroes, of quests and homecomings, of the eternal dance between mortal and immortal, between fate and freedom, between darkness and light. The myths are complete, the circle closed, the story told. Rest well.